You're listening to The Health of Business, where we talk openly and honestly about what it takes to run a healthcare clinic business in BC and Canada today. I'm Danielle Boyd, and I'm glad you're here. Hello, and welcome back to the Health of Business podcast. This episode is another solo episode, and today I want to talk about self-audits, an internal self-audit of a clinic in BC or Canada. And I know that the word audit can sound quite intimidating, right? It's scary. We think of CRA, insurance audits, maybe a college investigation when we hear the word audit. What this really is an internal self-audit. And I'm talking about a proactive review of your clinic systems, its structure, your workflows, and just identifying any areas where risk might exist. It's really a way of looking under the hood of your business before someone else has to. So preemptively doing that hard work so that if, say, an insurer wanted to do an audit on your clinic, you know what to expect and you've filled any gaps that you may have identified through this internal audit process. So in this process, we are asking, are we actually doing what we think we're doing, right? Do our written policies match what's actually happening on a day-to-day basis? Are our billing, charting, privacy contracts, practitioner relationships, communication processes, and operational workflows, are they clear enough that we could explain them to someone else if we needed to? A really big one is a lot of us clinic owners rely on assumptions instead of actual systems. We've inherited a lot of our processes and workflows and contracts and things like that. So that really is the heart of it. This is taking a moment to really sit down and do the work of identifying where any of these gaps might exist and preemptively doing that audit so that, if, and hopefully it doesn't happen, but, audits do happen so that, in that case, we've done that business health check. So we know exactly where, any of these gaps might exist that we need to work on, right? So it's really about giving you a structured way to review these areas, especially in the areas that clinics most commonly carry risk. I'm going to go through the 5 main areas and then give you a whole bunch of different questions and reflections you can ask yourself or your team can ask to help identify what some of these are to, eventually tighten processes and just make some better decisions before those gaps become a bigger problem. So along with this episode, I've also created a freebie toolkit that encapsulates some of these reflection questions and has it broken down into these 5 main areas. And that's a freebie, download on my website. So danielleboyd.ca/free resources. You'll find that there and you can download it, do a bit of reflection around your own clinic questions and just ask yourself some of the questions that I'm going to ask in this episode today. So that, you can do a preemptive audit on yourself and decide if and when an internal audit might be appropriate for you. So why does this matter, right? The reason is because all businesses carry risk. We are going to carry risk no matter what. And healthcare businesses carry several different kinds of risk at the same time. And because we live in an area that is so regulated, we're dealing with insurance companies, there's a lot of different aspects of risk that exists within a clinic potentially. So things like clinical risk, obviously, are professional risk. We have liability insurance for that. But it exists, right? Regulatory risk, privacy risk, billing risk, tax and employment classification risk, contract risk, operational risk, communication risk, reputational risk, and just general business risk, right? So there's lots, and no clinic or business anywhere can remove all risk completely. That's impossible. There's many things that we can't see coming. COVID is an example of that. That was a risk that, was not able to be completely eliminated ahead of time. So it's not a realistic goal to completely eliminate risk. But the goal is to understand where risk commonly lives in a clinic, right? And to make sure that we've looked at those areas and the obvious ones before they become problems, right? Like we want to prevent future problems by addressing them ahead of time, right? So a lot of clinic issues don't arise because of people intentionally doing things the wrong way. That's That's rare. That's very, very rare. Most risk comes from, vague systems or outdated documents, informal workflows or handshake agreements, unclear communications, inherited habits, like we said, and assumptions that no one has really revisited in a long time. So these are the areas that we're gonna look at. So some examples might include, like, someone set up a billing process years ago, and that clinician might not even, or that administrator might not even work in the system anymore, in the clinic anymore, and now everyone still follows it, but we've never questioned why it exists or if it needs an update, right? Another example we see often is contract templates getting reused because it's the one the clinic has always had, or it was inherited from another clinic, or it was the one someone received as the clinician, right? So we see that all the time. Contracts are expensive to have drafted. So I get that. Um, it's really a tough one that we see also here, is like that contractor employee classification piece. The CRA audits are real, so we'll talk about that a bit more here. Privacy and like cyber stuff is really important, especially as everyone's using Jane and EMRs. And some other areas that we're going to look at too are like client facing policies. So cancellation policies, no shows, credit cards on file, things like that. So a lot of those things I just listed there may not necessarily feel urgent on their own, right? Like it's something that kind of just exists in the back of our mind and we're like, "Oh yeah, we should look at that," but it's not pressing, right? Like we're typically putting out fires in real time and these things kind of exist in the background, taking up that cognitive and mental load that as clinic owners we know exists constantly. But together, all of these things create the operating reality of a clinic, right? So if there's multiple of these little systems that need an update, the exposure of all of them and the sum of all parts here is what can create risk if assessed externally, right? So this is why self-auditing matters. It helps you find the low-hanging fruit and the really obvious areas where clinics can get into trouble, right? So it really helps us catch the gaps that are visible. We just need to slow down enough to look at them, right? We all know these things exist and we always have intentions of doing it. But sometimes they just get bumped to the next to-do list because we have more pressing fires to put out in the moment. So yeah, there's a few ways we can do these self audits, right? So this is where, we know these things are existing in the background. So maybe it is that we stop as a clinic owner and our leadership team, and we sit down and do a formal internal review once or twice a year, right? Like this might look like setting aside a day, a couple days a week to go through these key areas of the clinic. You might review like charts. You might look at your billing workflows, your practitioner agreements. You might review your privacy access in Jane. You might look at your consent forms, your cancellation policies, and compare those documents to what's actually happening in practice, right? So this is a more structured, formal approach to it. And if it's not scheduled or structured, then oftentimes it just gets pushed along, right? So, um, the other way some people might do it is to weave self-auditing into your normal operations. So it might be that like once a month we pull a sample of charts and make sure everything is looking good from an insurer perspective. Or maybe once a month we look at our consent forms and make sure that those are all good. Maybe once a year we review our contracts, right? So you kind of have an interval upon which these things are looked at, whether by ourselves as clinic owners or leadership team, or we delegate that, right? So it is either, you can look at it one way from like just do it all hard stop formally once a year, twice a year, or yeah, maybe you look at each piece of this and you delegate it out at a certain interval that's maybe a little more frequent but less formal, right? Um, the other component of this is you can bring in external support, right? So sometimes there are times when this really makes sense, right? Like, especially if you're opening a new clinic, maybe you're changing your business model. Maybe you're going from, an IC fee split to hourly employees, right? Like, and you want to make sure that you're transitioning really well. Maybe you're adding direct billing, subtracting direct billing. Maybe you're adding a new discipline. expanding locations or adding some non-regulated services to your offerings. It can be really helpful to have someone external look at the structure. And that's not necessarily because that external person knows everything magically about your business, right? That's not the case. But often clinic owners leadership are just too close to their own systems, and we can carry bias, right? Like it's easy to think that is written in a way that reflects a certain policy, but in reality it's actually written in a way that doesn't. So having someone externally and unbiased look at that can be really, really helpful. The other thing that having an external person can do is really offer accountability, right? Like we can schedule that internal thing, the internal audit, but something else more pressing might come up and we might just like reschedule it and kick it down the road, right? So bringing in someone outside can look at what's actually documented, and what's actually happened, and look at the gaps from kind of an unbiased lens, right? So at the end of the day, there's lots of different ways that we can do that. That's kind of the three main ways that these things tend to happen. But at least doing it at all, I think, is a huge win for a clinic. The fact that you've even thought about it, the fact that you're even listening to this episode means that you're aware that this is something that needs to be done, right? So kudos to you. So what are the 5 areas to look at? So I'm one of those people that does these external audits. I mean, I'm not hiding that. This is something that really has kind of become a passion of mine. It's been really interesting and exciting to support clinics through this process. And so when I do these processes, I really look at it from the 5 main areas. So the first is professional regulation, or like college obligation. So this would include things like our corporate setup, professional standards and things like that. We're going to dive into each of these areas in more detail in the rest of this episode. So the second area is insurance company requirements. So this is thing like direct billing, audit exposure, terms and conditions, consent forms, and things that are required when direct billing or working in an insurance landscape at all, whether you're direct billing or not. The third area of risk that exists is through the CRA. So this is really the independent contractor and employee classification area. So definitely something I know a lot of clinic owners are well aware of as a potential risk. The fourth area we see risk in is like privacy, records, and data custody. This one is kind of a newer, well, I mean, it's not newer, but it's always been around, that's for sure. But things like hacking and password compromise and things like that, computer theft, all of that can really create risk around all of our digital footprint that exists within a clinic. So this is an area of risk that we need to address, absolutely. And then the last area, the fifth area, is the business operations themselves. So things like internal communication, client-facing communication, and just general business risk, where you're getting your patients from, and whatnot. So those are the 5 main areas. There's obviously going to be lots of overlap within those areas. There might be more beyond that, but most risk that we assess a clinic will fall into one of those 5 categories, if not, 1 or 2 of them, right? So we're going to break each one of those down. I'm going to walk through each of the 5 areas at a fairly high level. I don't want to make this too overwhelming, but I will give a few reflection points that you can kind of ask yourself, like, hey, are we doing this within our own clinic? Are we checking on this? Are we aware of this? So here we go. The first area is the professional regulation college obligation setup here. So this is where we have to look at our corporate setup, how money's moving through the clinic. Are we following college standards, scope of practice, all of these things, right? So this is where I think a lot of clinic owners need to be really conscious that not only is a clinic a business, it's a professional practice environment, right? So we're not, yes, we have to run a business and keep the lights on. Absolutely. We have a financial duty to support our staff and whatnot, and to make sure that the business is financially healthy. And we have to make sure that our regulated professionals that are working in this environment are supported. There's no barriers to, working within their scope, and that, everything is done as per college regulation, right? So our clinic systems should really support these professionals in meeting their obligations. So things like making sure we have good consent forms in place, proper charting and documentation systems and workflows, use of titles, delegation to assistants, receipt definition, so making sure receipts are done correctly and have the right documentation on them, and then describing the way our services are delivered, as well as how they're billed, right? These things are all really, really important to make sure that we are operating correctly within a professionally regulated and legislated system. So, corporate structure is a really big one here, and a lot of you have listened to my corporate structure episode, so I won't go into the specifics around which types of corporations can bill what and what not. Highly recommend you listen to that episode. But we have to be really thoughtful about what entity, so which corporation or sole proprietorship is billing for which services, especially when we have regulated and non-regulated services under one roof too, right? Like that's where things can get quite complicated. So, um, this is where the structure, professional regulation, receipts, patient communication, and billing flow, these things all kind of overlap within this. So this is something that really needs to be evaluated. So some things that you can ask yourself is, are patients clear about what type of services they are receiving? Are they receiving, physio, RMT, kin? Are they receiving Pilates? Pilates delivered by a physio assistant, etc., right? Who is providing that service? Is that person regulated or non-regulated? Who's billing for that service? What does the receipt say? What does the website say about it? How are we presenting that to the public? What does the booking page say? These details really matter because we have to be really clear to the public about what services are being delivered, if they are regulated or not, et cetera, right? So it's not just about whether the service is valuable. It really is about who is delivering it. Is it within scope of practice? Is it being billed through the correct corporate structure? And do the patients truly understand, or at least have the information available to them that makes these things clear, right? This becomes really important in multidisciplinary clinics, right? Different professions may have different standards, scopes, advertising rules, delegation rules, and record keeping expectations, right? So the risk may lie in assuming that what is fine for one profession is fine for another. It's not necessarily the case, right? Um, so clinic owners and leadership can often fall into a gray zone here, right? So, a practitioner is individually accountable to their college, right? They have professional duty to uphold. But if a clinic is controlling the systems that shape how that practitioner practices, bills, documents, communicates, issues receipts, that has to all be in support of the clinician's duty to their college, right? And to the public. That's really the important piece here. So, a really strong reflection question here would be, if someone looked at your website, your receipts, your corporate structure, your billing flow, and the actual service delivery, would these all tell the same story, and would they support compliance at the college regulation level? So area number two is insurance company requirements. So this is things like, Pacific Blue Cross private insurers, ICBC, MSP, WorkSafe, all of these areas, direct billing, and then being audited by any of these entities, right? So there's a huge amount of risk that exists within the potential of being audited by an insurer, whether that's a government insurer or a private insurer. So this section is more about whether claims are submitted correctly and the documentation is done correctly. It really is about whether the clinic can support and defend any of its insurance related workflows or any of the things that it submitted to an insurer. So the decision to direct bill is a big, big part of this, right? And I have a whole episode on direct billing that you're more than welcome to go back and take a listen to. It really goes back through some of the considerations that a clinic owner should look at before making the decision to direct bill or not. Lots and lots of thought that should go into that decision. And whether you direct bill or not, there's still the potential for insurance company risk and exposure, right? So, direct billing is super convenient for patients and helpful for clinics, but it does come with risk and responsibility. So, when a clinic submits a claim, it is working within the insurer rules, like those T's and C's that they have on their website. By submitting a claim, you are saying that you are willing to work within those terms and conditions, right? So, the big thing is making sure you are aware of those T's and C's if you are going to submit a claim to an insurance company, right? Um, there's consent requirements that exist within that, documentation expectations, and then payment policies in the event of a rejection from an insurance company. So just because a claim is submitted and paid does not automatically mean that the claim was appropriate, right? So it only means it went through. So for example, we know Pacific Blue Cross doesn't allow for PTSW, physical therapy support worker services. If you were to direct bill for something that involved a PTSW, um, knowing that there is risk in doing that and that the potential of an audit may trigger a repayment as a result of that is really, really important, right? So, being super familiar with these T's and C's is essential if you are going to be doing direct billing. So, um, a big question is really around, could we explain and support what happened from what we build to an insurer or to a patient even if they asked questions later, right? That's really at the end of the day a huge big part of that. So a huge component, number one here, is documentation. This is how we're going to support this. Are practitioners charting well enough to support the service that was billed, right? Is it clear? Is it accurate? If the insurer requested the records, would the chart clearly show what happened, who provided the service, why that service was billed, what the medical indication of that service was? Was it signed at an appropriate time? Does the date on it match the date of service on the receipt, etc.? All these things are super, super essential, because if they don't match, that's a huge risk mismatch, which is why doing an audit on your charts is essential, right? Not only for the insurance component, but for the other things that documentation supports. Another really big thing to ask yourself is do we have direct billing consents on file? So some insurers have specific consent forms that they require, like Pacific Blue Cross has a different form than any of the TELUS insurers. And so making sure the forms are being collected and they're being documented, they're on file. And then are we checking in regularly to see that those consent form requirements haven't changed or if there's anything different going on there, right? Another really big component of insurers, of working with insurers, is patient responsibility and communication, right? Are the patients being clearly told that direct billing is not a guarantee, right? Like, we will do our best to attempt to direct bill, but the patient must be aware that they will be responsible for any monies that are denied or anything outstanding, anything that is not covered within that service, right? They also need to have a certain amount of understanding of what their policies do cover, right? If a patient is with, Pacific Blue Cross, say, it is up to them to be aware of what it does and does not cover, right? If it doesn't cover PTSW, then they explicitly need to know that and communicate that, right? So I think it's really important to make sure patients are well aware that it is their responsibility to be super familiar with their own policies, because we don't know what those policies look like on our end, right? We do our best, but at the end of the day, we submit. We submit as per the T's and C's, and we do our best. But every policy is different, and we can't see internally what a patient's policy looks like, right? So patients need to understand that their plan might have limitations, exclusions. It might have a deductible it has to hit. Does it require a referral from a doctor? Are there maximums? Do they, there's a whole bunch of pieces that I think patients really should be responsible for understanding about their own policies. And they need to understand that they will be responsible for any payment if a claim is denied, reversed, partially paid, or audited, right? I've mentioned this one already, but a huge component here to look into is the insurer terms and conditions, right? Is the clinic actually familiar with the terms and conditions of the insurers and billing platforms used? There was a lot of chatter last year around the terms and conditions that ICBC had laid out for BC clinics last year. PABC has done some incredible work around having conversations with ICBC and updating those. And so now the T's and C's are a lot clearer and a lot more appropriate in terms of what a clinic is responsible for if they want to be an ICBC provider. So making sure you're really familiar with those, because the minute you do submit to one of those insurers, you are bound to their terms and conditions for audit, for repayment, and so on and so forth, right? So a lot of these terms really are around consent, documentation, which services are eligible, provider responsibility, audit cooperation, repayments, and reversals, right? So making sure you're really up to date with those. A big part of that too is often those terms and conditions are changing. So a lot of clinic or a lot of insurers will send an email, hey, updates to T's and C's go into effect in 30 days. But if you look at some of the T's and C's, what they actually say is we can change these with a 30-day notice, and it is up to the providers to actually be on top of that. So we need to be checking these terms and conditions regularly. They are changing. It isn't necessarily going to be information that is pushed out to us. So we do have a duty to stay on top of these things, right? So really important that we are watching for any changes and then communicating those changes to administration and our practitioners, right? A big part of this too is workflow clarity. So is everyone clear with who is submitting claims, who's reviewing them, what any limitations are around who can and cannot submit them? And then if anything needs to be escalated, what happens if something is rejected? What happens if something is pending? I think a lot of risk and breakdown exists when practitioners are just sort of out of the loop and allowing admin to do everything on their behalf. And then vice versa, when admin is allowing, practitioners to do whatever documentation or whatever, services they want to, there really needs to be clear communication and guardrails around what's being provided and what's being documented. And how things are being communicated between those doing the actual billing and those providing the services, as well as to the patient, right? So that clear communication channel is really essential if there is direct billing happening, or if we're providing services that are insurable at all, right? So direct billing is obviously not a bad thing. I think it's an incredible service that can be offered, but it touches on so many risky points that we need to have guardrails in place and really strong communication around it. I think that's really the big thing here. So a great self-audit question is, if an insurer asked us to support a claim tomorrow, could we competently produce the chart note, the consent form, the billing rationale, any of the insurer terms and patient communication that existed around that to defend any sort of like pokes from an insurer, right? Like, are we confident that what we billed was accurate, that what was documented around it was accurate, complete, and clear, and that we communicated everything that was necessary to the patient to support that, right? So that's a really big one. I think that's probably one of the biggest areas, in addition to the next one, that risk exists in, right? So the next one, this is the big one. Huge area of risk that exists is from the CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency, and the employee versus independent contractor classification risk. This is huge, and this is obviously not novel within the community. This is a well-known area of risk for clinics, and a lot of clinics are doing excellent work to really mitigate their own risk, to create new employment models, and I think there's some really cool things happening. For clinics that are not comfortable with having IC risk, right? So there's some really neat staffing models being explored in the private system right now that I'm excited about. So, yeah, this one is huge. And again, I have another episode on this. So I'm not going to dive too deep into the difference between an employee and an IC. I've done that already. So highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode if you want to dive into, learning the difference and the classification system that the CRA uses to determine whether someone's an employee or an IC. But ultimately, what this is about is looking at what the contract says and then what the actual working relationship looks like, right? So just because we call someone an independent contractor doesn't automatically make them one, right? The CRA looks at the entirety of the relationship, not just the label, but they also don't look at it's not a checklist, right? Like there's several areas that need to be looked at, and they look at the relationship as a whole. So if one area looks a little bit more employee like, but the majority of it is more IC like, probably going to lean more towards an IC. Right. But I'm not going to go and fully unpack here, but I really think this is a really, really major area that every private clinic owner and practitioner, in fact, should be aware of, because the risk actually affects both the owner and the practitioner, right? So some of the core themes to look at around this is, so here's a few of them. So control. How much control does the clinic have over the practitioner's schedule if they're classified as an IC? So here's how to look at it. If you have employees, you're probably going to be less risky in general than if you have independent contractors. So if you have independent contractors, these are some of the things we want to look at, right? So how much control does the clinic have over the practitioner's schedule, their fees, their availability, their treatment style, their administrative duties, their requirements to attend meetings, communication, and just their overall day-to-day work, right? That level of control is something that the CRA is really going to look at. Another big one is business risk. So is the practitioner carrying any meaningful business risk? I.e., are they paying rent? Are they paying for their own supplies? What sort of financial overhead are they putting out on a regular basis? Or is the clinic carrying most of that fixed overhead, right? Like if the clinic is just paying, a fee split and carrying everything and buying all of the consumables and the admin and the software and everything and doing all of the marketing, that's going to be a little bit more risky than if someone is actually carrying a bit of risk themselves. Another big area is the opportunity for profit. Does the practitioner have the ability to make business decisions that affect their income? Or are they mostly just like showing up and receiving a percentage, right? So what they're looking at here is how much control over their work they have. It's kind of a control thing, but it's also like, can they scale? Can they hire someone else? Can they subcontract? Can they work at other places, right? So that's a really big one here too, is that opportunity for profit. So another big one that they look at is integration. Does the practitioner look and function like a part of the clinic staff, or do they look like a separate business operating within or alongside that clinic, right? So this is where things like branding and uniforms and business cards and, websites are really, like what is the optics of the relationship? Does on the website it says distinctly this person is an independent contractor? Do the receipts indicate that as well? Do they have a different brand name and this just happens to be a business partnership versus, are they wearing the clinic's uniform, and are their business cards branded the same way and whatnot, right? So that's really the optics of that integration. So there are a few more within that. The CRA stress test, I went through every single aspect of that in the other episode. So strongly recommend, if you're interested in that, to go and listen to it, because I do a much more thorough breakdown there. I also have an episode where I talked about the fee split model and how it is really high risk as well. So a couple episodes for you to dig into there to learn a bit more about that. So really the big one is, does the contract that the contractor was given reflect, a contractor relationship? And in reality, does that agreement match what's actually happening, right? So if the contract says they're a contractor, but then they have to get approval from the clinic owner to take time off, they're wearing a uniform and they're, not taking on any overhead, they might look a lot more like an employee, right? So this is where clinics get exposed, when there's a mismatch between the agreement and the actual working relationship. And this is where, if a reclassification by the CRA happens after an audit, there is the potential that a lot of money could be owed in taxes and back pay from both entities. So this one is really high risk if not done well, right? So again, this does not mean that every contractor, like every fee split model or every contractor scenario in the province is wrong. I'm not saying that. I do think that it has to be done very thoughtfully though, and it has to be shared risk on both parts as opposed to the clinic taking on all of the risk and the clinician just showing up and seeing people. Right. So I think there's a bigger conversation around percentage splits, like I laid out in my other episode. But really, at the end of the day, making sure that the match exists between what you've described and what's happening in reality, right? So if the CRA looked at the contract and looked at what was happening in reality, would those things match? That's really, at the end of the day, what that self-audit looks like within the clinic. So the fourth area that risk exists in is in privacy, records, and data custody. So this one really deserves its own episode, but maybe next season. I haven't done that episode yet, but this can get really technical, and there's a lot of legislation, HIPAA, PIPA, college standards. There's a lot. And with HPOA changing, there's new rules around keeping records for 16 years. There's a lot. So I'm not going to pretend I am super, super, super up to date on all of this. But at the end of the day, what this means is we have to be aware that privacy breaches are a potential risk for a clinic, right? So it's not just a checkbox, right? Like it's not just on the consent form, like I consent to having an EMR record. It's really about how the patient information is collected, how it's used, disclosed, accessed, stored, transferred, retained, and protected. All of those things are super important. Jane does an excellent job of making things really, really secure. So kudos to them. Their platform, I know, meets a lot of the security requirements, and especially like at the beginning of COVID when they pivoted to the telehealth model, they did an excellent job of making sure it was compliant. They have great consent forms built into their telehealth component as well. But there are a few key things that we can do to further bolster our risk protection from this area. So a big one is who has access to our EMRs, right? Do they actually need that level of access? So, if a staff member left the clinic months ago, should they still have access to our Jane? Probably not, right? So making sure that like former staff, contractors, students, and practitioners are removed promptly when they leave, or that they only have a certain level of access that they require for their work, right? A big one here too is how is patient information being shared through things like email, text, online forms, shared inboxes, cloud storage, and other things, right? It's easy to become a bit more lax and send emails and name patients and things like that, but making sure that we are being compliant with privacy requirements through those other formats that exist outside of our EMRs as well, right? Obviously, getting consent to share that information is really helpful, but making sure that we have the proper systems in place that, should a breach happen or an email hack happen, identifiers are not included in there, right? So, a big question to ask oneself is if there was a privacy breach, would the clinic know what to do and who was responsible, right? So, you know, another thing that can be really helpful for mitigating this is cyber coverage. There are certain policies that can help in the event of a breach. And a breach isn't necessarily just a hack, right? Like a really big part of this is our devices. Like if our phones are stolen, could someone get into our Jane account? If my computer was stolen at the back of my car, could someone get into my Jane account, right? That's actually probably a much more real scenario than, yeah, being hacked or having someone get into our system or, get through our two-factor authentication processes, right? Um, that's really a really important thing here too, right? So a lot of it is, consent forms and making sure patients are aware of the risks that come with that, but then protecting ourselves in those events, right? Um, a really big thing here too is, especially at the beginning when you're onboarding someone, discussing how they will be offboarded, right? So this is why we have contracts, because we want to make sure, obviously we want our relationships and our business partnerships to look great and to be great and to be healthy and to be awesome. And sometimes things break down. So having a contract or at least a clear offboarding process is really, really helpful in general, but even more helpful when we discuss what happens to charts and records and EMR access in the event that someone leaves a clinic, right? So, um, obviously staying within legislation is really, really important here, but having definitions around who is the custodian, who owns the charts, what happens to the charts afterwards, how charts move between practitioners afterwards in the event of someone leaving or opening a new Jane account or whatnot from there too, right? So having these things defined at the beginning can make the end a lot smoother and cleaner, right? um Things like exporting data, we can't just send charts to another practitioner. We have to have patient consent. So making sure we have patient consent when it comes to moving things around, right? So a big question here to ask ourselves is, do we know who can access our patient information, why they can access it, and what happens if that access changes? And then also what happens in the event of a breach or theft of a personal device. So the last section that risk exists in is more of like a general business liability risk, right? So here I'm talking about like internal communication and client-facing communication and policies and just general risk, right? Um, so this is the final section, and it's kind of distinct from the first four. Like the first four have kind of like specific threats, right? Like they have specific entities that are going to look at us, right? So like, the college and the government are going to look at us in the first scenario, and then insurers are going to look at us in the second scenario, and then the CRA is going to look at us in the third scenario, and then, like the legislation and government who govern privacy are going to look at us in the fourth scenario. In scenario 5, there's a whole kind of cluster of like ranging from mini to big risks that exists just kind of in general, right? So this is really about everyday communication, where we're getting our patients from, operational policies, and just really the glue and the through threads that hold our clinics together. So many problems internally or externally at a clinic start because expectations and communication were unclear, right? So a vague policy or an inconsistent communication process, an unclear role, a verbal agreement, these things can create conflict if something goes sideways and they weren't defined in the beginning, right? So this is where having really clear clinic policies and contracts that reference these policies can be really, really helpful, right? So internally, some of the things I would be thinking about is whether the team knows who to go with certain questions or issues, what types of things can be decided independently, especially if you have contractors, they need to have that, and when to escalate things and where to escalate them to, right? Um, are practitioners, admin, contractors, employees, and owners clear on roles and responsibilities, right? Are there clear pathways for unusual situations, complaints, incidents is a big one, billing questions, patient concerns, or, like policy exceptions, right? If you make a policy and someone wants an exception, right? Um, who do you communicate policy communications to, right? Like if you're going to change a policy or create a new one, how are we pushing that information out, right? So um, things like meetings and team updates and expectations, are they aligned also with the type of relationships you have with the people in your clinic, right? So like it's going to look different if you have employees or contractors, right? The other area here is your client-facing policies, right? So do patients and clients have really clear understandings around things like cancellations, no-shows, refund policies, payment expectations, response times, communication channels, and what happens, around direct billing, like we mentioned before. So Do patients know who to get a hold of for booking questions versus clinical questions? Do they know, what's appropriate for email or text? Do they know what requires an appointment? Like they can't just call the clinic and ask a whole bunch of clinic or clinical questions to a practitioner, for example. Urgent versus non-urgent requests. Um, and are they receiving consistent answers depending on who they're talking to, right? So are the policies clear amongst and consistent amongst all the staff, right? So like if a clinician or sorry, a patient asks a clinician a question, are they going to get the same response from the front desk, or are they going to get a completely different response? Or are they going to get an I don't know, right? So this is where misunderstandings and confusion can really arise. So that's a really big one. Another big thing here is appropriate insurance, right? We already mentioned the cyber insurance, but another big one here is like, does the clinic have appropriate general liability coverage? Do the practitioners have their own professional liability coverage? They should. You shouldn't hire them without them. Do we have that cyber coverage? Are we clear on what those policies cover, right? Because if we have independent practitioners, they may need their own policies, right? So this is really important to have clinic policies, but then make sure that our staff are aware of what policies they also need too, right? So this is where, you can never be overinsured. Sorry. Oh my gosh. You can never be overinsured. Like obviously insurance is expensive, and our risk tolerance is going to be different person to person, but sometimes it's better to have too much insurance than not enough, right? But really at the end of the day, like, do we have coverage? Is everything, appropriate? Is it aligned with what our needs are, what our relationships are, amongst the clinic as well? So, at the end of the day, making sure we're not exposed here, right? Um, Another really big one here is having really great onboarding procedures and offboarding procedures. We've kind of mentioned that already, but having an operations manual or, a policy book, a binder with all the answers to all of these questions can make life so much easier, right? Like good operations and workflows reduce risk because they reduce improvisation and they reduce confusion and questions, right? Um, so a good rule of thumb is if you're getting the same question over and over again, this is where you create a policy, right? If we're seeing the same scenarios arrive or behaviors happen, this is where a policy is important, right? So, um, having good guardrails in place, good escalation and communication channels, who to go to for which type of question, this is really, really helpful, right? Making sure that answers are given consistently across the board. This is really, really important, right? Um, Another really big thing to look at here in terms of like general business risk too is where are we getting our patients from, right? A really big, lesson from my clinic ownership days is we had a lot of people that were on a Pacific Blue Cross policy, right? So really diversifying our patient sources is important because sometimes those policies change and patients may not be able to continue to see you on the regular basis. So having a really diverse group of patients can help really mitigate risk if there's any policy coverage changes or, anything, job loss or anything that happens in that group of people, right? That's another really big risk to look at. So, um, all in all, the big self-audit question here is, are we relying on like memory, goodwill, or just sort of like informal communication channels when it comes to internal systems and client-facing systems? Or do we have clear documented processes? Do we have really consistent answers? And are we, answering questions or making policies around some of the common questions that are coming up, right? So those are some great questions to look at there. And really at the end of the day, another big one too is just to see where conflict does arise. Like we said, it's impossible to mitigate all risk. It's going to be impossible to mitigate all conflict. So, if we see a source of friction or we see an area where conflict is kind of arising on the regular, are we doing something about it? Right. So, really taking those reflections and documenting it. Another big thing we see here is like incidents. If we have a patient who maybe treats the front desk poorly, are we discussing it? Are we debriefing it? Are we making decisions around it? And then communicating how, are we barring this patient from booking online? Are we, how are we dealing with this? And then communicating across the board too. So doing good incident investigation and policy updates is a really big part of this as well. So lots to think about here. Those are the 5 main areas, and looking internally at all of the systems that you're looking at here, might surprise you. It's amazing how many of these things we think we actually have covered, and then we're like, "Oh, actually, we're not getting a consent form here," or, "I didn't know those are the terms and conditions over there," or, "Actually, that looks a little more employee-like than I like. Let's update the contract." So looking at these things and, kind of either sitting down and doing it formally, spending a few days and just doing it all at once, weaving in certain categories into, like the operational stuff here at the end, like those little conflicts that happen, making new policies that can be woven in really easily, right? Whereas a full contract review might take some time and some dedication, right? So really at the end of it all is it's a way to move out of kind of like vague uncertainty to like practical, I know exactly what I'm working with and I know where my risk exists. And now I have some action items that I can do about it, right? And yeah, like I said, like a lot of us have this background feeling that there's probably gaps somewhere. We know our contracts might need updating. We know we might need a privacy update or a new cyber policy, right? Like we know these things are happening, but doing that self audit makes it so much more manageable and we can like really glaringly see and fill the gaps that we identify, right? So again, you're not going to eliminate every risk possible. Like every business is going to have risk. It's not possible to eliminate it all. Um, but our healthcare businesses are complex, right? There's way more layers. There's way more players. Woo, that was a fun little rhyme. More layers and players than, like a typical, general business might have, right? So it's great to be able to identify these like common areas where risk tends to live in these businesses, right? So we can really address the low-hanging fruit in some of these aspects and really look at the areas where clinics most often run into trouble and just ask ourselves like, where are we exposed? And if so, what needs to change, right? So in full disclosure, this is the work that I do. I offer these external audits. This is something that I've developed a framework around. I help clinic owners look at these exact areas, right? Like professional and regulation, college obligations, corporate and billing structure. We can look at insurance and direct billing exposure, CRA, contractor classification risk, privacy and record custody, internal and external communications, and just general operational and liability, right? These things are um, totally in my wheelhouse, and I thoroughly enjoy doing this. So, if this is something that you've been thinking about doing, or maybe this episode brought up a few kind of like, interestings, right? Um, this is probably something that's worth doing, whether on your own or whether assisted. Um, Please know you don't have to fix everything at once, right? Like knowing where risk lives is the first step, right? And just starting to mull it over. So, like starting to kind of poke and pull threads, I think is a really great way to do it. And if something, you know, strikes you as wanting to do something more formal, more structured, you can learn more about my consulting work. My website is danielleboyd.ca. More than happy to chat about this with you because I really, truly believe that well structured, and well managed in terms of risk clinics can really create a solid foundation from which we can scale and really make healthy clinics and businesses. So I thank you very much for listening to this. I know it's not the most exciting, sexy topic, but I think it's really, really important. And once we have that clean foundation, we're well aware of, what needs to be done. I think we can grow so much more confidently in the future. So thanks for listening. That's it for this episode of The Health of Business. If you're navigating any of these challenges in your own clinic, know that you're not alone. If you're interested in working together on any of these challenges in your business, head to danielleboyd.ca to learn more about my consulting offerings and to get in touch. Catch you next time on The Health of Business.